Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing how to leverage workplace data in facilities and real estate planning. I'm going to take you through a brief outline of what we'll cover today. And firstly, we're going to provide some examples into how we've seen real estate and facilities teams leverage data in their short and long-term planning. And then we're going to move on and look a bit deeper at what actual reports and metrics that these teams have been using and how it's influenced their planning and decision-making. And then we're going to move on from that and look a bit at kind of the unexpected ways that people find that they can use their data in updating their policy and actually in managing the day-to-day operations of their building. And then to finish off with, we're going to provide some insights into what it actually means to have an occupancy solution in place and the things that you need to have prepared and the impact it'll have on your employees and the organization. Joining me today as the key speaker is OpenSensors CEO and founder Yodit Stanton. And by way of introduction, Yodit, if you could provide some insights into what you meant when you said this quote that's on screen at the moment, I think that'd be a great way to get kicked off.
Hi, David, and hi, everyone attending. Thank you for your time today. In the sense, hybrid working trends have been, they're now bubbled up as the way to work post-COVID. But these trends were already making progress with activity-based working concepts. And a lot of people that have been in this industry for some time have been gradually bringing in activity-based working in a lot of corporations. What COVID really has done is accelerated this shift in a major way. So 5 months ago, we surveyed just over 1,000 people working in different companies all over the world. And it is, the verdict is clear. We've got consensus on 9 out of 10 people want to keep working from home 2 to 3 days a week, mix it with office, but they're using the office differently. Like there's a small minority that will want to work completely remote. Others, again, a small minority want to work completely in the office. And so the shape and the way offices are going to be designed is changing greatly. And focus now is how do we understand better what people need from the office, and how do we innovate and really cater it and make it fit for purpose to the more modern type of working. And that really is, it's not cookie cutter, it's not standard. It comes with a deep understanding of employees, both in terms of objective and subjective understanding. And that really is data.
I think what you said there about cookie cutter and no one size fits all approach is a great way to lead into this. What we've got now is 2 examples of projects that we've been working through with clients, and hopefully they'll highlight going into a project with a specific goal in mind and who's actually running it will impact the priorities, the way they're actually developed, and the results from these projects. So firstly, we're going to have a look at a facilities example, which is the very topical shift to hybrid work. So for this organization, it means moving away from the traditional one-to-one desk allocation type environment to a more agile and flexible environment, which centers largely around the actual desires of employees themselves in how and where they want to work. So firstly, if you could provide some insight into the internal and external factors which kind of drove the change and made this organization decide to make the shift?
External factors are specifically the acceleration of COVID, and people really realizing there's some really positive impacts that they've had in remote working. But for the majority of people, they really miss the collaborative aspect. So it's taking what works remotely and what works for office working and figuring out a strategy how to tie it together. In a sense, this shift has kind of really brought about a real great change in the way people are going to interact with the types of spaces that are available in the office. If I have a desk for focus areas and at home, I'm going to keep that, but the kind of what I'm going to demand of the office is going to be more collaborative areas, being able to speak to people, do some project work and so forth. And again, that shifts the way, like the configuration of the layout and so forth. So they're using a lot of data and really trying to understand deeply the usage and then planning ahead for their project.
Do you think there's a bit of employees kind of thinking, well, we pivoted very quickly with the pandemic and we're willing to work from home, we did all this, and we demonstrated that we can, and it's kind of like a quid pro quo, like we did this, now it's your turn to accommodate us a bit. Do you think that's a fair statement?
To a degree, and also I think the nature and the way they interact and the more asynchronous nature and the way their work has changed. It's not just that we've done this, but it's going back now and unpicking is more or less impossible. I think teams have now configured to consistently communicate a certain way and have a different rhythm to what they did before. And the organization just has to accommodate that. And I think for the most part it's positive. There are some downsides, so that it's also kind of understanding quite deeply what the downsides are, and then facilitating how to craft policies and the space itself to ensure that is minimized.
Yeah, I get it's kind of you can't put the cat back in the bag type thing. It's happened now, so it's just a case of making sure that it works in the best way it can. And with so many moving pieces, so in this project, shifting to hybrid work is going to update the way employees are moving around the office, when they're in the office, what they're doing there. And with that many moving pieces, how many departments and which departments do you think should be kind of key stakeholders in these projects to be successful?
Well, within the return to office working groups, we're seeing it's fairly consistent. There's obviously, facilities management and corporate real estate. Additionally, obviously, HR is taking the lead in a lot of these working groups because, HR has to think about, retention and well-being and strategically figure out what that looks like for their organization and set the policies alongside. IT is highly involved, between remote and, let's say, offsite and onsite, experience has to be smooth and seamless. And already there's been a large amount of investment in the infrastructure to enable remote working. And I think that will continue as people come back on site. Finance and corporate real estate are now, a lot of our customers are in the middle of their lease cycles. So they're now starting to go, okay, how, looking ahead, what is it that's going to be necessary? What investments are necessary? And what savings are actually possible based on what we know?
So that kind of leads in nicely to the second project, which we're going to mention, which is a corporate real estate-led project, largely to do with space allocation and space management. So looking at those leases and using data to make sure that they've actually got the right amount of space and they've got the information they need for any drastic change. Comparing the two, what would you say the kind of difference in long-term goals are between a real estate-led project and the previous facilities-led project?
I think the long-term goals around the forecasting is really key. Consolidation, we're seeing consolidation or shutting down and subletting floors already. And then others, and then it's not just consolidation and scaling down. Actually, others are taking a different step. Instead of going for just a central HQ, actually going for a strategy of having many satellite offices that are nearer to people. Within the survey that I mentioned previously, actually a significant percentage, I think it's about 30%, are looking to expand their real estate. So I think a lot of people have this misconception necessarily that most organizations real estate would dramatically shrink. We're not necessarily seeing that. We're seeing leases happen and so on. It's just the strategy is changing, and they're really kind of interrogating and working very, very closely with internal stakeholders in order to make these decisions.
Don't quote me on this, but I think it was Coinbase that said that they were closing their large central HQ, and their projects from then on will be these little satellite offices. So it might not be a complete change in total square footage, but the distribution of real estate and the purpose of it might be readjusted across quite a few organizations.
And that has a huge impact on how FM then go on to run day-to-day services. So I think it's an interesting shift we're seeing. Like broadly, I think a lot of organizations are slowly shifting and changing, but I don't expect that to slow down.
Like you said, there's going to be overlap between facilities and real estate and all of these, and it's going to involve building management, policy, actual employee behavior. If you had to kind of highlight some key problem areas or challenges which teams were likely to encounter in undergoing these kind of transformations, which ones would you kind of choose to highlight at the foremost?
The biggest challenge, I think, is the approach that's necessary is the iterative nature. A lot of things are going to change as we progress. We have, for example, that particular client has policies where they've allowed people to pick the type of worker they're going to be. So that between fixed, mobile and meaning, a couple of days in office, to fully remote. And they've asked people to pick their profile for the next 6 months, and then in 6 months' time they get the ability to change their profile or stick with it. We'll see how it works. I think it's an interesting concept. Other organizations are just enabling people to be much more dynamic in enabling booking systems and so forth, and come and go as they need to. But what we will see is that we will see the trends going up and down over the seasons I think people have preferences to work from home more in the summer months and are likelier to go into the office in the winter months when it's dark and it's colder and it's less kind of ability to be out and about locally. So there'll be an element of seasonality, there'll be an element of projects for different teams that will affect the trends. And this is going to be a constantly kind of evolving situation. And we're still living with COVID at the moment. So there will also be the external forces that will bring the trends up and down. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is constantly that iteration of the space and understanding of the standard for today.
The last question that we've got here on the slide is to do with metrics, and to highlight the difference in kind of what teams need to be looking at based on their project and the importance of actually catering your metrics to your use case. We've got some examples here of what people looking at the first example, so the hybrid working example, might be looking at to make sure that it's all going to plan and aligning with their goals. So if you could go through this slide and pick out some key metrics which you think are really useful and explain why they're so valuable, and some insights into the decisions that they enable teams to be more intelligent and evidence-based in making.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned seasonality already. So the monthly trends is a key one to understand seasonality. We're already seeing in certain organizations a vast difference between the trends for August to September. A lot higher occupancy in September than was in August. The weekly occupancy is also interesting because we see trends to where people converge in on the office in certain days, and then Mondays and Fridays perhaps being ghost towns. And again, that defeats the purpose of having kind of these flexible spaces. So it indicates that work needs to be done around allocation, team allocation and rotations. Asset usage is a big deal. It really tells you the breakdown between the occupancy and different assets types. And again, it's around, if desks are less occupied, but we've got a high level of occupancy in these types of spaces, let's shift things around. For lowest and highest occupancy, obviously, is the peak and when it's very, very low. And the bigger that gap, the bigger really looking at, again, kind of allocation. Most organizations are trying to keep the peak under 80%. Really, anything above that, you really are going to run into some problems. Keep it under there, but if the low is really kind of nearly zero, then you really have some things to dig into in terms of culturally or policy-wise.
If that's a very big difference, it kind of suggests that what you're setting out to achieve isn't what's happening, and something needs adjusting. We'll move on to the long-term reporting. As you can see already, they're quite different metrics, just even to look at. But so these are the ones where you'd be looking at a long-term, and in this case, a real estate-led project. So if you could, I guess, do the same again and go through and say why or how each one of these are used.
Sure. So the building stats breakdown is pretty self-explanatory, but for a lot of our clients, they have multiple sites. So it's also looking at across the portfolio when making consolidation and so on decisions is actually, it's important not just for one site, but for multiple. For me, the desk metrics are super interesting, but the one that's most neglected by a lot of people that is most eye-opening is usually the meeting room metrics. What tends to happen, and I see this over and over again, is the large boardrooms are consistently used by very small amounts of people, and shifting that and really understanding what is the ideal. Is it 2-person collaborative spaces? Is it 4-person collaborative spaces? Huddle rooms, meeting rooms, and so forth. And then how can we take the really underused assets, and underused meaning it's used all the time, but it's not used to its full capacity. So can we change that around to make it so that to cater for the majority? And meeting rooms, they take up huge amounts of space and they're costly. So efficiency within that is super important.
By looking at these, hopefully we've kind of shown how it's important to have a goal in your project and then kind of center the data that you want to use around them. What we've seen happen a lot over the last 18 months is that through gathering workplace data, you're then able to identify problems which you didn't necessarily even, or you might have known about before, but had no way of addressing. You can undertake some internal learnings or act on external learnings and then actually work on implementing those changes within your workplace. So a good example of that, which is really important at the moment with the pandemic, is the link between occupancy and air quality. What have you seen organizations and perhaps companies doing to act on government guidance in terms of well-being and air quality?
There's two sides. So firstly, within any indoor environment, people want to make sure that understand it's safe. So within the survey as well that we've published, it's a key factor for most people, and not just in offices, but any indoor environment. What we know from the research and also from government guidelines is, fresh air matters a great deal. The more fresh air there is, the less kind of virus transmissibility, quite simply in the air. We use CO2 as a metric for that, because that's what we breathe out. The more of us that there is in an indoor space has low ventilation, the more CO2 builds up. So as people come in not greatly ventilated spaces, you see CO2 will be low first thing in the morning. And as people come in and there's kind of more breath that's happened, you see the buildup. So monitoring CO2, does it actually spike during the day? And if it does, then really the air intake has to be looked at, pumping more fresh air in at a much higher rate on an hourly basis than you would have before. It is pretty critical. If it's fairly low and consistent, that means that there's good fresh air coming in. And that, from a health and safety perspective and from a well-being perspective, is key. And it's not just for COVID. I mean, fresh air is critical for other kind of flus and everything else. So these changes are positive, and it's going to be long lasting, because this is not just let's do something for COVID, it goes away and we go back to the way it was. Seasonal flu and colds and so forth have an impact. So I think there's going to be much more priority around air quality, indoor air quality specifically, going forward.
To kind of get a grip on that, you need to understand occupancy as well, so you can see how the increased numbers on certain days has an upward trend on CO2.
Yes, so if me and you are in an auditorium in a large space, the fresh air intake does not need to be as high, but the more people there is in an auditorium, if there's 200 people, the fresh air intake has to be much, much higher. So yes, for sure, occupancy is directly linked.
We've obviously been paying quite a lot of close attention to this as the pandemic has evolved. So initially there was the whole, you have to be 2 meters apart, and then there was the air quality piece. Having these systems and the data in place is pretty key in enabling organizations to actually act on that. It's all very good and well knowing it. Being able to do something about it is a very different matter. And well, I would say occupancy solutions and booking solutions combined provide a pretty good safety kit in terms of social distancing and air quality. Well, if you could explain quickly how booking systems and occupancy combined enable facilities and real estate teams to, without the physical barriers, create a safe space.
Yeah, so booking solutions previous to COVID was very much, majority at least, concentrated on meeting rooms, and meeting room booking is definitely very important, but there's been a huge shift and uptake in desk booking solutions that we're seeing. It's kind of both for safety and practical reasons. The way we've approached it is minimize the interaction and make automation built in much more. As an example, for us, for desk booking, the way we work is the sensors drive the check-in and check-out process, and it's automated. Booking solutions always have a big problem with no-shows, so automating that and getting assets released back into the portfolio so others can use it, and really making a lot of this stuff seamless is super important. What we were finding was clients early on were passing around who's attending and who's going to be in the office via email for contact tracing purposes. So again, we're ensuring that if you know there's an outbreak or if somebody's sick, you can quickly run reports to understand, okay, who else has been around. So again, contact tracing is a huge element. So booking solutions have existed. They are evolving rapidly to take into account these new use cases that have come up.
We spoke previously with some HR representatives, Sue Warman and Emma Dutton, and they were very keen on presenting the idea of hybrid work not as a free-for-all, but as it has to be a controlled environment. And like I said, there are serious risks that can happen if it doesn't go well. Employers will get frustrated if they can't access the space they require. And if you come in and it's a wasted journey, it's not only annoying for the employee, but that's actually going to have a significant cost in terms of productivity. So all of these data sources and tools work together to create that seamless environment, which kind of leads on to the final thing that we're going to look at, which is the actual process or impact of data gathering itself. So on the screen in front of you is some basic information about the type of sensors we use. But yet, if you could provide a high-level summary of how to get started with the actual physicality of doing or implementing an occupancy solution, and where you start from a goal, use case metrics, and top-down approach to it, that'd be a nice way to finish up.
So at a high level, the breakdown in sensors, you have your occupancy sensors, there's many different types under that, and then the environmental side. And again, there's many types. The way you best choose is very much use case driven. I mentioned the use case around meeting rooms. So for the larger meeting rooms, understanding the counts of people fairly accurately that are using those meeting rooms from a utilization perspective is important. For the smaller huddle rooms, you wouldn't necessarily need the counts, but you do want to know, huddle rooms, phone booths and stuff, are they used? Do I need more of them, or are we going to have less of them, and so forth? So you go from much more PIR based understanding, and same for desks. Really what you're trying to understand is, do I need more? Do I need less? Have I got my team rotations and my configurations right? So again, the PIR side makes sense. On the environmental side, obviously we've talked a lot about CO2. So there's CO2 sensors, and CO2 temperature and humidity tends to be the class that is around one type of air quality. There's particulate sensors for a different type, VOCs and so forth. So particulates being dust, and understanding if the filtration system is just pumping in more dirty air from outside. VOCs is around chemicals and so forth. And then the other class is noise, because some organizations are really trying to ensure that there is the collaboration spaces for the people that need focus areas and focus rooms. Keeping noise levels in check is important. The use case really drives the sensing and the data gathering capabilities.
Just quickly, so people can get a sense of what they actually need to put in place to gather this data. What's the kind of sensor to report process? How does that look on a physical sense within an office?
So for us as a company, the way we approach it is that everything should be easy. So for our customers, we provide the end-to-end, and that's a decision that we've taken based on making the experience as easy as possible. I know others do it in different ways, but from our side, we deliver the sensors, we create a network within the building that the sensors talk to. We don't talk to physical Wi-Fi's or anything like that. There's a standalone network just for the sensors, and then deploy the sensor deployment, and also then deliver the analytics and reporting. And that decision is because the underlying effect of the technology should be really seamless for the client. They don't care about what it is, how it works as such. I mean, other than that it's secure and robust, but they really want to understand, from my use case, I want to get to this point very, very quickly.
Just to finish up then, hopefully you've kind of got some idea of these points, but there's some key factors for consideration just to end up with. Gathering workplace data isn't only useful in terms of your initial goals, you can use it in many other ways. It's once the data's there, it'll highlight problems that you didn't know you have, and you can use it to update your policy and other aspects of your workplace to ensure that the framework in which people are working is correct. And secondly, it's really important in these environments to ensure that people, both employees operating within the framework and the teams managing the framework, have the tools they need to do so. So booking solutions, for an example, enable employees to access the spaces they require, but then also ease the operational workloads of HR facilities teams, who can then take spaces off the system or add them on as guidelines change, automate processes which were previously very time consuming, such as no-shows. It's all kind of feeding into the same process of making sure that the framework is as robust and easy for the employee as possible. Taking a bit of a step back, what's really important before you actually do embark or start one of these projects at all is having a very clearly defined idea of what you want to achieve. There's very little point in saying to your employees, we want you in the office 3 days a week just for the sake of being in the office 3 days a week. So making sure that the changes you make fit into a long-term project with a goal that ties into your company ethos and culture is very important. And finally, the sensors which we've just seen, the same PIR will provide the same data, but depending on your goal and your use case, the way you then aggregate or segregate that data will depend on the metrics you use, and that very much ties into how you get to your goals. So again, it's very important to consider what it is that you want to measure and how you break that data down to support it. We are actually over time now. Thank you very much for everyone for joining, and thank you, Yodit, for your time. If you want any further information, we have an ebook, and the reports that Yodit mentioned is available to download on our website as well. Thank you again, Yodit, and thank you everyone for joining.